Okay, and so why CARB is interested in this topic? So we all know that indoor air quality is impacted by many factors, both outdoor and indoor sources. And sometimes the level indoors can be higher than outdoors, and that leads to many health impacts. Residents in impacted community may face even more challenges to achieve healthy indoor air quality due to their housing conditions and lack of access to greener alternatives, as well as some actions like, for example, using gas stove for heating purpose during the heating seasons. However, recent studies indicate that information provided from low-cost sensor may motivate people to take actions to improve their indoor air qualities. Specifically, study found like during wildfire season, people use low-cost sensor to monitor their indoor air quality and can motivate them take action like close doors and windows to minimize the intrusion of outdoor air pollution into indoor environments. Therefore, low-cost sensors offer an accessible, user-friendly, and cost-effective tool for people to monitor indoor air quality and could be a part of the solution to lower indoor air pollution. However, efforts to monitor indoor air quality using low-cost sensors are still sparse in impacted community, partially due to lack of technical supports and other resources. And also, low-cost sensor itself needs some technology advancements. For example, the use of low-cost sensor for gases, air pollution still needs to be explored further. Therefore, CARB founded this white paper research study. Our goal is to provide a one-stop shop of information on low-cost sensor for indoor air quality monitoring. This research has 3 arms. First, to collect information. We want to understand what's the current available low-cost sensor for indoor air quality in the market, how do they perform, and are there any indoor air quality study using low-cost sensor in overburdened communities, and what's the lesson learned from those studies? And also, we want to learn about stakeholders' opinions, experience, and suggestions on using a low-cost sensor for indoor air quality monitoring. And we also want to provide guidance on how to integrate low-cost sensor into indoor air quality monitoring and help improve indoor air quality overall. And we also want to see what's the recommendation from different stakeholders to help improve the utility of low-cost sensor in this indoor air quality monitoring field. So CARB staff is still exploring the plan for various outreach activities, such as idea about like developing a search board dashboard for low-cost sensor for people easily to look up and compare different low-cost sensors, provide guidance in plain language about low-cost sensor selection, deployment, and maintenance, and also like provide a central hub for additional resource on low-cost sensors so people can easily look up information that they need. And also, if needed, we can prepare a short webinar to recap information from this study to community member, because this seminar is more technical oriented, but some community member may need more like practical information from these studies. But we're also open to any suggestion about how to disseminate the information from this study to the public. So if you need more information about this study, we have a project webpage as shown here, and we will post the white paper guidance and the presentation slides to this webpage, in addition to the meeting recording when it's being processed. Any additional updates to this study and low-cost sensor related information will also be included on this webpage. And if you have any questions regarding this study or our next step. And please feel free to reach out to me by email, and my email address is listed here. And today we have two speakers. The PI of this study is Dr. Sesanika Ivy, and she is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering and the PI of the air quality modeling and exposure lab at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on air pollution science and engineering and environmental justice. And she is an emerging leader in the area of regional air quality modeling and its applications in community scale air pollution exposure assessment. She works in partnership with community organizations across California to prevent the over-industrialization of already overburdened neighborhoods. And our second speaker is Dr. Jennifer Ofdal. And she is a principal air quality specialist at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And she recently completed her PhD in environmental science, policy, and management at UC Berkeley, where she was co-advised by Dr. Ivy. Her doctoral research investigates air pollution and environmental equity across indoor and outdoor environments, using advanced analytical techniques and low-cost sensor. And with that, Dr. Ivy and Dr. Ofdal, you can start your presentation today. Let me just stop sharing.
And just for reference, Jennifer's last name is Ofodile.
Oh, sorry.
Alrighty. Thank you all 109 people in this seminar. Thank you for coming and engaging with us to learn about what we've been up to for the last couple of years. The title of the project is Low-Cost Sensors for Healthier Indoor Air Quality in Impacted Communities. And so I'll start out by just talking about what an impacted community is. Essentially, environmental justice communities, disadvantaged communities that are overburdened by air pollution. So in this context, next slide, Jen. I really want to thank Dr. Ofodile for all of the hard work that she put into this project. She led tests 1 and test 2, and this project would be nowhere without her. Next question, or next slide, rather. Alrighty, so we were asked to provide one slide to rule them all, okay? So we do have a key outcome slide here. Our 2 deliverables for this project were a white paper to summarize the 3 tasks that we were asked to do, as well as a community-facing guidance document that's pared down and the language is a bit less jargony, right? And so this is a summary of the accomplishments to date. So first, we conducted a market survey, once again led by Jennifer, where 72 low-cost sensor devices were reviewed, originating from 31 manufacturers. And so the outcome of task 1 is a summarized report, very detailed, of these low-cost sensor packages, specifically for indoor air quality monitoring, and she also summarized their associated performance. The second outcome of this project was a research overview of 31 peer-reviewed studies, specifically centered on indoor air quality assessment using low-cost sensors. The aim was to pull papers that specifically worked with impacted communities. So as you can see, that's a small subset of the low-cost sensor body of literature. And so the outcome of this was a summary of the commonalities across these studies, the knowledge gaps that emerged, particularly along the lines of adoption in impacted communities, use, and overall challenges with those technologies. And last but not least, task 3 for this project consisted of stakeholder interviews. So I led 10 interviews they range from about 30 minutes to an hour, where the information provided was sorted into the common themes, and the outcome of this activity were what I felt to be very relatable and informative firsthand experiences about low-cost sensor use across 4 different stakeholder groups that we'll talk about in just a second, advice about quality assurance, and firsthand information about how those different stakeholder groups decide to go about troubleshooting their use of low-cost sensors for indoor air quality. Next. All right, so this is more the structured project overview, what you'd see in our proposal. So the goal of the project is to produce a white paper that synthesizes the information I just talked about, and also develop the guidance document specifically for impacted communities. So this project is motivated by what Zoe talked about earlier, and it's really just compiling information that's more accessible for impacted communities that may have limited access to technical, educational, and financial support for the use of those technologies. And so on your right is an overview of the objective and tasks for the project, which I've already gone over. So we'll transition to the next slide. So if anyone needs a library of acronyms, feel free to take a screenshot at this time. You'll see these peppered throughout the presentation. Next slide.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ivy. Yeah, so as Dr. Ivy said, this has been a really interesting and really great project over the last couple of months and years. And I'm just going to go into more of the technical aspects of the report, my tasks of 1 and 2. So the first task centered around the review of these local sensor devices and their associated performance. And our goal was to really, have a place where we can have a number of these devices summarized in one place, and to make sure that they were only suitable for indoor applications. And to do this, obviously, it was an effort that elicited the help of different resources that were available out there. The first step was to look into, air quality agency resources, government resources that basically are like the first line of, regulatory information about these kind of efforts. And so looking into the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Air Quality Sensor Performance Evaluation Center, established by the South Coast Air Quality Management District here in California, was that foundational step for me. As I hope that a lot of people here have heard of AQSPEC, if not, but AQSPEC was established, for this effort of commercially available local sensors and to provide guidance on the data quality and interpretation. After this first foundational step, I looked into other resources like air quality forums and websites that have more individual contributors commenting on, their experiences buying these devices and using them. So blogs like See the Air, Breathe Safe Air, and even subreddits that talk about air quality on a day-to-day basis. And then after this, then I looked further into like internet marketplaces that have basically a plethora of different devices being sold by third-party retailers from China and other regions of the world, and basically narrowing down what were the popular local sensors being sold there, what were people buying, and what were people reviewing, to kind of like limit that list and to be relevant to the project. So because there was such a large amount of local sensors being found for indoor air quality monitoring, we had to implement a search criteria. And I'll go over these 8 criteria over the next few slides. So firstly, we had to define what a local sensor was for this project. We decided on making sure that they were integrated and packaged devices. So for example, the Purple Air, which is quite popular here in California, would be a local sensor for this project. And this would not include any single components or single sensor components like the plant tower sensors that are within Purple Air monitors. And this is because these sensors are more user-friendly for our target audience, of community members or the general public. They can easily be deployed out of the box, set up, and start monitoring air pollutants, as opposed to single sensors, which, require additional expertise or equipment, like a serial connection, proprietary software, and other technical skills that are not really accessible to the general public and community members. However, though, there is a lot of popular manufacturers or common manufacturers that are typically used to make local sensor packages and monitors. And like Plantar, I just mentioned, there are also other manufacturers like AlphaSense and Spec Sensors that also make both particle sensors as well as gas sensors. And these are kind of state-of-the-art manufacturers being used in a lot of studies nowadays. So currently, when we talk about these pollutants that we want to measure in indoor spaces, there's kind of 5 technology types that are really used to measure them, and they fall into the categories shown here. So for particles and like particulate matter, we really rely only on like light scattering. Basically, particles have this ability to scatter light, and this is affected by the particle size as well. And I'll talk about that more later during the performance section. But for gases, we have more of a range. We have electrochemical sensors, metal oxide semiconductors, non-dispersive infrared, and photoionization detectors. And these technology or techniques are more preferable for some pollutants over others. So for example, the NDIR sensors are typically used for carbon dioxide measurements compared to other gases like ozone or like VOCs. So what does a sensor package look like? This is maybe something that doesn't come to the mind of everyone, but a local sensor package, has different integrated components that allows it to work efficiently to produce those air quality measurements. So here, the most important thing, as we just went over, are the raw sensors that, measure our pollutants. They detect them with certain efficiencies, and they're able to report the concentrations back to us. But within the package, you also have, how that local sensor device is powered, how you can retrieve the information. Is it a display on the device, or do you have to go to a website? And that push to that website or that mobile application is done through some transmitting component within the sensor as well. And then they're all controlled through a microprocessor or some kind of circuit to make it all work as one component. Okay, so that was the first criterion. The next are going to be 2, 3, and 4. So here we wanted to really focus on sensors that were designated as indoor applicable or to be used for indoor spaces by the manufacturer. We do know that you have outdoor sensors that can also be deployed indoors, but because indoor and outdoor environments differ in terms of like the range of environmental like parameters, like the range of temperature or humidity, but also indoor environments tend to have more short-term spikes in pollutant concentrations versus outdoor environments in some areas. We thought that, or we assumed that, these manufacturers are basically having some factors into consideration when they designate their local sensors as indoor specific compared to outdoor sensors. The next was that they had to measure real time or near real time for pollutants, and this is typically the case for all local sensors. And then also that they had to measure any of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard criteria pollutants, as well as hazardous air pollutants or air toxics, which are important because they have implications for our health and environmental state. We also took into account the availability of these local sensor devices, right? Because we don't want to share anything that has been discontinued or is out of stock, even if there can be found like on eBay or a similar internet purchase platform, because there's also past local sensor devices like the Spec sensor that were really popular a couple years ago, but they're no longer sold, and that would be a disservice for the audience that we would share this with later on. We also set up price points criteria for our sensors to kind of like differentiate how we would categorize them. So we had less than or equal to $500 for single pollutant sensors, and then less than or equal to $2,500 for sensors measuring at least 2 pollutants. And obviously we had links to where you could purchase this if it was directly through direct purchase site, or you had to get a quote from manufacturer for like bulk orders. The 7th criteria was basically having this balance between what sensors were being included. So like I mentioned, with the plethora of devices on like Amazon and similar internet marketplaces, because they're just like they're inundated with these devices to be sold, we had to kind of like limit it and like be okay with limiting our devices like bestsellers being sold and those that like are being engaged with the public or whoever's buying them on these websites. And so that's kind of like that kind of allowed us to have a more stringent a selection of devices compared to like well-characterized and popular sensors sensors like the purple air, of course. And then lastly, obviously, we want to know how these sensors perform in the real world. And so whatever sensors had any performance evaluations available out there through either peer-reviewed research or agency resources through gray literature, we also included that information in the report as well. Okay, so what was the outcome of the market survey? So as Dr. Ivy mentioned earlier, we ended up with 72 local sensor devices from 31 manufacturers, and this is further broken down into 30 single pollutant sensors and 42 multi-pollutant sensors. As you can see here, multi-pollutant sensors were more abundant or more common, and it makes sense because I guess manufacturers and even end users or buyers want to have more bang for their buck, and if they're able to measure more than one pollutant, that would be really helpful to people really interested in air quality. And here is just an overview of those local sensor packages that are suitable for indoor air monitoring. So these are single pollutant sensors. I've mentioned purple air a couple of times now. In our lab in ACMA with Dr. Ivy, we use the applied particle technology minima for our personal monitoring and wildfire exposure classifications. And then you have other sensors that are also used, like a CO2 sensor and more or less them. Okay. And then same thing for our multi-pollutant sensors. Here we have the 42 manufacturers and those models. And again, you have some more popular sensors like the IQ Air is gaining more popularity in the United States. And then you also have sensors that are being made by big brands. So you have Amazon that makes their own sensors, and then also IKEA as well. So yeah, this is like a growing field. There's a lot of interest in indoor air quality as well as deploying these local sensors to track air pollutants in these environments. So here's an example of how some information or how information about these devices that were found were summarized. So we have kind of like two big chunks of data frames. One of those is shown here right now as A. It basically summarizes like basic information about the sensors, so like their pricing, where you can find them, useful resources like how to set up and any interesting notes. I want to note here like the battery and power specification. So sometimes it has come to my attention that some end users are really concerned about the energy consumption of local sensors. Will it increase my energy bill, or do I have to change batteries all the time because batteries cost money? So this is something to take into consideration when you're thinking about these kind of devices. With the second data frame, you have more technical aspects of the device. So what pollutants are being measured, what individual sensor components are within those packaged devices, right? Most of the time, manufacturers don't really, share this information on their websites. But whenever I did find that, I included it. And then the accuracy and other parameters shared by the manufacturer as well. Again, I want to mention the data transmission and retrieval process. This can also be an issue for certain end users who are concerned about privacy with connecting their devices to like Wi-Fi, as well as if they're not really technically or technologically savvy, having to like open a website on a computer might be more of a hassle compared to a phone. So another point of consideration for these devices as well. Okay, so now that we've seen what the market survey entailed, how do these devices actually perform in the real world? So local sensors and their performance are affected by several factors. This can be internal or external. And an example of this would be the actual target pollutant and the technology used to measure the pollutants. So I said that there were 5 state-of-the-art technologies right now. So for example, particulate matter sensors kind of have some limitations, which I'll show in the highlights. But particle size distribution, which is dependent on the source, is a very important thing for these sensors because particles have to scatter light. And for some sources, particles are either too small or too big, and they cannot efficiently scatter light, and so the local sensor has poor detection efficiency and is not able to see these sources, and that can be again another thing that impedes the utility of these devices for IAQ or indoor air quality management. Across performance evaluations through research efforts, agency efforts, there really is this big thing that there is like a lack of standardization with these evaluations because people or these stakeholders are performing their validations using like different metrics. There are no standards in place right now, and people are just doing things according to like their well-known best practices. However, though, even though this is the case, you have different metrics like the correlation metrics, like coefficient of dissemination, measurement metrics like the mean squared error. There is a commonality where they use linear regressions to look at the correlation of low-cost sensors to reference or research instruments, and they typically calculate for the coefficient of determination, which is quite common. So here is again what are the commonalities these performance evaluations do share. So you have the R-squared I just mentioned. You have a mention of what devices or what reference or comparison instruments are being used, where these evaluations are happening, as well as the pollutant types and the sources being measured. Specifically, though, with AQ-SPEC, which is one of the big players in performance evaluations of low-cost sensors, they have defined or developed protocols to measure or to validate these devices both in ambient outdoor conditions as well as indoor and laboratory conditions. And here, you know, they measure or they validate these devices in triplicate, where in the outdoor conditions, they do this in Southern California. Using obviously the ambient conditions there. I made a note of 5-minute data because the averaging scheme of pollutant measurements or pollutant samples is important because it definitely affects the granularity of, you know, how they correlate when you come to the comparison between different time resolution data. For the laboratory testing, this is done in chambers, and they use artificial aerosol for the particulate matter sources, and then they create a gas atmosphere through using calibrated gases in those chambers as well. And as with regular studies, they report, you know, the R-squared slope information, which tells you if these sensors are overestimating or underestimating measurements, as well as error measures, and then other important information like the intramodal variability, which is actually quite important because it tells you the quality control of the units by a manufacturer, so that whatever unit you're being sent, if it has a low intramodal variability, that means that you can be confident in receiving whatever unit that is being sent by the manufacturer without it having an impact greatly on accuracy, reliability compared to the other sensors from the manufacturer. So here's another data frame showing how performance information is summarized for these devices. I'll go from left to right, so can read it one piece at a time. So here we're looking at IQ Air sensor, the Air Visual Pro. So firstly, we have the reference where we get the information from of their performance and where they're being conducted, right? So let's just go with AQ-SPEC because I just talked a lot about that. So same thing, they're evaluated in both ambient and laboratory conditions. And they use artificial aerosol, since we're looking at PM 2.5 here. And then we look at their comparison or reference instruments because this is like a governmental body or air quality agency. They all use reference grade instruments. These are like the EPA FEM or FRM instruments. And then the outcomes of these tests results in that R-squared value showing the correlation of the devices. So here we see pretty great correlation for the laboratory tests, which, you know, is a recurring theme, but moderate to stronger correlations for the ambient test. And here again, I have some notes about some useful information. We had this low-cost sensor had low intermodal variability, shows that, okay, quality control might be something that's good for this manufacturer. But then you see like in ambient conditions, it tended to underestimate, but it was overestimated in laboratory conditions and, you know, so on and so forth. And then here below, I couldn't show all of the performance references for this slide, but this device is quite a popular one and has even more resources to show more validation tests of the sensor. Okay. So what were the highlights on the outcomes of performance evaluations? So here for particulate matter sensors, we found that, you know, there's an overwhelming amount of these evaluations. Again, this makes sense because it's easier, I would say, to miniaturize the technology for, you know, like the light scattering technology for PM 2.5 and other size distributions, and to do it at a low cost. And also there's a lot of, you know, recent interest in the health effects or health implications of PM 2.5 with wildfires in California, and as well as other sources in other regions as well. We found consistently moderate to strong correlations for PM1 and PM 2.5, which, you know, has to do with the source, which is, you know, the last bullet there. But in contrast, we found poor agreements, or basically like not even a responsiveness to PM10. And again, as I've been saying, this is really due to the sources and the particle size distributions of these sources that has an impact on the detection of these low-cost sensors. So in indoor spaces where cooking and candles and like similar sources have more of the particle numbers and mass in smaller size distributions, these local sensors cannot see these sources, or like the detection is quite poor, and is the same case with like dust conditions and other similar sources that have larger particles, like greater than 1 micrometer. And yeah, there's still limitations to be aware of. So that's for particulate matter. Now we move on to gases. So for gases, overall, we found limited evaluations for both packaged or integrated devices, which are defined for this project, as well as the individual sensor components. And this can be due to different factors. So the first is probably measurement complexity, to do a more controlled test of the pollutant gases, right? If you're doing it in a chamber, you need a chamber or a laboratory, right? Which is not something you can easily deploy in like a home. So you can have controlled concentrations of whatever gas like VOCs that you want to test for that validation. But also there are also limits of detection issues for these sensors. So for example, with indoor environments like a home, you can have VOCs that are very low trace concentrations like benzene, but they're also like toxic at those low concentrations. But because of how, I mean, these are not cheaply made, but they're limited in that technology and that technique, so they can't really detect these very trace amounts of pollutant concentrations, and that's like a big thing. These sensors also suffered from a lot of cross interferences from non-target pollutants for the performance evaluations we did find. So for example, an ozone ozone local sensor was sensitive to nitrogen dioxide, which should not be the case, right? And so for this kind of issues, at a research space or a research institution, we have the capabilities to invest and actually correct for these issues, but that's not really accessible to the general public or community members who want to, use these devices for those applications. Overall, though, we saw that there was more evaluations for carbon dioxide. Which is interesting. The carbon dioxide technology uses the NDIR, which is based on infrared active, compounds and absorption of light at certain wavelengths. And so because this technology is, I guess, just like PM sensors is more straightforward for CO2, it makes sense again why we're seeing more of those evaluations compared to other gases, which can be more complex in their implementation. Other highlights that are important are that overall we found better performance of these local sensors in indoor settings. So it can either be a home or laboratory or even chamber compared to outdoor conditions. And again, this makes sense because in indoor environments, there's more controlled conditions compared to different climates across the country or different regions where like you have different sources impacting measurements. You have environmental factors impacting measurements as well, like temperature and humidity, and more of that being a factor. And then for those laboratory evaluations, which are performed better than outdoor conditions, there's also an issue here where like they might not often overlap with the full range of indoor sources or conditions for an indoor environment or a normally occupied indoor environments, despite best efforts to like have specific ways that they're evaluating these sensors with specific sources. So looking forward, with the utility of local sensors, there are some key points that obviously are known or are being looked at by researchers, manufacturers, air quality agencies, and the like. So the first big thing is the evolving landscape of these devices, right? There needs to be technological improvements in the design and performance, just for better reliability and accuracy, right? We need better data confidence in these devices, right? So that we don't have to apply as many corrections or as many calibrations for regular end users, right? That's what researchers are currently doing right now. And there's a need for performance standards for validating these devices, but for both researchers and manufacturers. And AQSpec is leading the charge again here. They contributed this ASTM standard for evaluating PM 2.5 sensors in indoor environments. And we need more of this. We need more of that standardization so that we can have a better consensus when it comes to comparing these devices across different studies and different environments, and more of that. Overall, we see that, while calibrations and corrections are key in specific applications. They might be less relevant to some local sensor like end users. But like I said, the better baseline accuracy is still optimal, right? We need self-correction for some local stuff. For some local sensor devices, we need them to be able to self-calibrate at some point in their lifetime or multiple times in their lifetime, just so that we can have better data confidence for the public who want to use this data to basically advocate for the indoor air quality and say or explain their lived experiences with their indoor air quality. Despite all these limitations, though, local sensors do remain useful for tracking indoor air quality trends for those sources that can be detected, right? If you're smoking indoors or like you're burning some incense or similar dominant PM 2.5 mass source and maybe other gases like leaks, like your gas is leaking or something, they can be useful in detecting those source events. And then some important considerations to have with their utility is that there might be other aspects of these devices that might be more useful to end users compared to the high data confidence needed. For example, bringing them back again, the ease of use, data access, basically just like accessibility is like a big thing. And I think lifetime is something that needs to be more at the forefront, right? So some manufacturers say that their devices last anywhere from 2 years to like optimistically 5 years. But this is like, if it's going to be an investment, this is something that should be more transparent in the fact that like, oh, can these devices be maintained? Can you have replacement features? And what is the overall like investment cost for the end user if they do decide to purchase low cost sensors? And so with that kind of wraps up task 1, and now I transition to task 2. So for task 2, we're looking here, as Dr. Ivy mentioned, at studies that kind of use local sensor devices, right, for indoor deployments and indoor assessments of the air quality in those spaces. Our goal, before I even get into the goal, just an overview of the indoor environment. So Zoe mentioned earlier that, we have a lot of sources in indoors. So starting from like outdoor infiltration, if you live close to a lot of pollution sources, like you live next to like high traffic areas or like industries, you're going to have some of that infiltration in your indoor space affecting your indoor air quality. You have different activities also impacting indoor air quality, right? And the frequency of the activities also is a factor. And then lastly, you have different contributions from different things that are within that indoor environment that also contribute to the degradation of indoor air quality. Like, oh, how old is your house? What are the building materials looking like? Are they off-gassing certain harmful compounds, right? And then obviously like the introduction of different products that the occupants of the house are bringing into the home. And then if you have like poor moisture control, you can have things like mold also affecting your indoor air quality. Okay, so now going back to the goal. So our goal here was to perform a literature review that kind of summarized these studies that use local sensors for indoor air quality monitoring. And as I was obviously looking into, these studies and trying to gear them towards our project objectives, I found that there are different types of these kind of assessments with local sensors. The first is your run-of-the-mill indoor evaluations of local sensors. So basically, how do these perform in a normally occupied indoor space? What's going on compared to reference instruments. We also have studies that focus on basically engaging the occupants of the home and seeing how local sensors can, alleviate or help better understanding of indoor air quality. And then lastly, we have crowdsourced studies, which are getting more and more common nowadays by using public available data of local sensors. The Purple Air Network is a big one here in California, and during the wildfire seasons, there's been multiple papers about, the impacts of wildfires and other sources on PM 2.5. But yeah, that's another big part of these indoor studies using local sensors. And so because of this different types, we again wanted to make sure that we were aligning to the scope and the objectives of the project. So we had to implement another criteria for this task. So this criteria made sure that our scope was really focusing on the participatory nature of these studies, right? We wanted to require the involvement, engagement, or collaboration of if it was researchers or agency partners with the occupants of the space that they were collaborating. We also wanted this to be in an actual normally occupied indoor environment, so no simulation of indoor conditions in like laboratory or chambers. And then lastly, we limited our findings of these studies to the United States based on different factors like the climate, right? The climate is different in our country versus other countries, as well as the building construction, which also differs as well. And then most importantly is the definition of an impacted community. Other regions don't have the same metrics that we do to really define overburdened or marginalized communities. And this was very important for this study to keep that scope within that frame. So from this, here just basically an overview of what some keywords that were entailed for our search of those studies. So we used 2 databases, and through the search, we were able to limit our study to 31 final studies, Dr. Ivy mentioned, which I will show an overview in the next slide. So here's an example. Excuse me. So here's an example of another data frame of how we summarize these studies, just giving like an overview of what they entailed. So again, I'll start from left to right, going through this table. So first we have the reference and what year the study was published, and then exactly when the study happened, so and what region it happened in. So I'll use May et al. 2021 as an example. So this occurred in Western United States, so Washington, Seattle, and then it used crowdsourced data, like I mentioned earlier, the Purple Air Sensor Network. And they also had residents that they actually did an additional filtration case study looking at wildfire infiltration and effects. And the goal here was to, evaluate the intervention with that filter for on indoor air quality, as well as just overall see the infiltration effects of PM2.5 on wildfire days. And again, measurements were popular sensors and PM2.5, the PM2.5 pollutant. So now I'm going to give 2 examples actually focus on impacted communities and the outcomes of some of the studies. So for this first study example, here we have Webb et al., which focused on Native American reservations in the Mountain West region of the United States. And here, this was a community-based participatory research study where they engaged these Native American tribes. And these tribes were rural tribes that are typically overlooked for larger tribes like the Navajo Nation. And they really wanted to, discuss and collaborate with representatives of the tribes and actually tribe members to see what were their areas of concern for, air quality or indoor air quality in this case, and which came up to be respiratory issues and similar other concerns like asthma. And from this study, we found that for the 2 tribes that they engaged, tribe A and tribe B, that they found sources that were impacting indoor air quality, right? Like they had wood burning, which was a big one for heating. And obviously, if you're burning wood in your indoor space, that's going to create a lot of particulate matter and also other toxic gases like carbon monoxide as well. But results from the study show that, these Native American tribe homes did have some issues, from their indoor air quality being monitored. So, for example, 2 out of the 8 tribe B homes had at least 5 days of PM2.5 being over the EPA's daily limit. And the bigger issue for this study was actually the radon concentration, because radon is like one of the biggest factors for lung cancer. And they found 5 out of the 11 tribe A homes and 4 out of the 8 tribe B homes had radon levels that were above EPA's action level, as well as compared to the US average, which was a big problem and showed the discrepancy or an even distribution of exposure risks across tribal housing, right? For looking at a comparison basis to region-wide or nationwide. And because of this study, which was really helpful and really enumerating, they implemented some remediation responses for the homes that were impacted by this really high radon, and they had planned to have further testing and further remediation past the study publication, which I hope in maybe a few years we'll see another study by this group showing that they engaged or carried out more studies or more remediation for these tribes. The second example looks at a worker study in Southern California in Santa Ana, where they engage the Latino population using wearable Atmotube Pro sensors measuring PM2.5. Here, this was another community-based participatory research study that took into consideration the concerns of Latino workers working in this industrial facility where they had, they could see probably like smoke or feel the high PM in their workplace, and they wanted to actually measure these pollutants and see what was going on in terms of concentrations and potential exposures. And because of this, they were able to outfit 8 Latino workers with the wearable, as well as have 8 stationary monitors across the 2 industrial facilities. The findings here show that, there were high PM 2.5 concentrations for both buildings where these Latino workers were, and that the maximum concentrations of the local sensor were exceeded about over 212 times on a 1-minute data basis. And the most interesting part of the study was that there was the view of that whatever work you were doing in that facility kind of had an impact on how much PM like you were being exposed to, which makes sense. So the welding group, so sanding and welding or just welding, had higher PM 2.5 concentrations that were, exceeding like unhealthy levels compared to other workers that were in assembly, oversight, or sheet metal folding. And this study actually, in their conclusions, they mentioned that this data allowed them to kind of speak up and ask, their employers to have better air quality controls, filtration in the study, to even get HEPA filter max for those that were disproportionately exposed to PM 2.5 as from the data or as data showed. So with these 2 studies showing the examples of impact community and the impact and the effects or the utility of local sensors for monitoring PM 2.5, we have a conclusion of how this also affected or were shown through the other studies. So from the 9 studies that we were able to find, or we were able to like note as fit in the project scope, right? They were focused on impact communities. They were focusing on that participatory nature. This really showed that, within local census studies and even indoor air quality studies, which are growing, the field is growing, that 29% of these studies focused on these communities, which shows a kind of a lag in community-facing studies and the prioritization of these studies, right? Because it does take a lot of work to engage communities, to continue that engagement past the 1-year mark, the 2-year mark, and it just shows that we need more work in this area. We saw a range of different settings. I talked about a Native American reservation. There were also industrialized regions in Southern California, as well as oil and gas impacted areas in Pennsylvania and other regions. And the sources impacting the indoor air quality in these studies and with these communities were solid fuel for household heating, right? Where you're burning wood. You have a lot of outdoor pollution, right? From the outdoor sources being present or being proximal to these communities. You had wildfire smoke infiltration impacts, as well as occupational exposures, like we just saw in the Latino worker facility, but also like even in a hairdresser shop as well. Okay, so some further commonalities that these studies shared were the motivations for the studies, right? Like they were engaged to basically look at concerns that community members had and health impacts of poor IQ that they were probably living through. Big one is like asthma, other respiratory heart issues, and more. And these studies were possible due to partnerships with academics or agency individuals or stakeholders, which kind of shows that they play an important role in actually making these kind of studies a reality or providing support or funding for these studies to happen. Shared characteristics were just really high indoor pollution levels that exceeded air quality guidelines, as well as previous findings in other national homes, which again, is kind of the same story when it comes to overburdened communities and even now their indoor spaces. We found that there was variability even within the studies that were impacted by factors such as like the amenities. One study found that some homes in a low-income study pool had range hoods that were either filter-based or recirculating, or even no range hoods, and that affected how much PM that was present in the home compared to homes that didn't have any range hoods within that study. So again, also differences within studies as well. And then there was engagement levels that were different across studies. So some studies had active engagement by participants, right? They wanted to like see what their air quality was like. They wanted to do something about it. But for some other studies, community members are already dealing with so much on a day-to-day basis, and then having a local sensor was another added task that they had to, look to and like kind of have on their mind, which was not very attractive to them. So consideration to have for these communities. And then lastly, just challenges with technical and data issues with the low-cost sensor device, which more on the researcher side, but one thing I want to highlight here are cost issues. So for an example, I think 2 or 3 studies, they were provided with filters. The community members were provided with filters, but the issue was, these filters get dusted, like there's like a particulate matter buildup over time. And if there's no additional funding to replace these filters, right, to keep them working, they really can't be lasting change or lasting intervention because, again, not very accessible for these communities to have that long-term indoor air quality management. And yeah, overall, we just found that, with the studies and with their future-facing commentary, that ways to improve indoor air quality will need to focus on or continue to focus on community engagement and education, right? We need more education about indoor air quality risks, mitigation, and, for studies that are actually successful, we need longer studies, right, to see the differences across seasons or the efficacy of interventions over time, and then the scaling up and broadening of these studies across different types of communities. A big recurring thing is, again, affordability of these tools, either local sensors, cleaners, and a big part of the support and maintenance, support for maintenance and replacement of these solutions. And at the more regulatory scale, we need stronger regulations that, increase occupational inspections. This is a big thing for marginalized populations who might who might have workplaces with poor amenities or poor facilities. And if they speak up, they could face retaliation, which could be a big issue for them. And this is like a big thing to take into consideration. And then lastly, on the manufacturer side, to have better accessibility to local sensors, there needs to be improved data access and integration of user-friendly applications or accessibilities to these devices. That's a big part. And so, yeah, with this, thank you for listening. I'll give it back to Dr. Ivy to round us up with our stakeholder interviews.
Thanks, Jennifer. Next slide. All right. So I found this exercise to be quite informative. It was a great experience learning from folks who are using low-cost sensors out in the real world. So the goal of task number 3 was to conduct these stakeholder interviews, and we were seeking out people who have experience using low-cost sensors. They didn't necessarily have to work with impacted communities, but it was a bonus if they did. So the stakeholder groups were these 4: low-cost sensor manufacturers, indoor air quality researchers, members from impacted communities, and general low-cost sensor users. So the group number 4 would not fall into the previous 3 groups. The total number of interviews was 10. The number in parentheses to the right of the groups are the number of folks that we were able to interview. So for those people who are listening, who carry out sociological research, participatory-based research, this is not easy. And so kudos to those of you who are doing high volume work in that area. So some of the themes that came up as a result of these interviews were unique experiences, recommendations, best practices, and caveats. So recommendations are generally what worked for those groups, but we don't necessarily see that as a technical best practice. It's just what worked for them at the time. Best practices are those advices that tend to show up in the literature as well. Unique experiences are things that I haven't heard from any other person that was interviewed. And caveats are things that new users should be looking out for. Next slide. Okay, so I'll talk to you all about what we were thinking when we went into these interviews. So specifically for the sensor manufacturers, we only had one interview, but the potential pool of contacts came from the companies that are listed there. So we wanted to understand what the market advantage was for the device that they were representing, what their best practices were for reference co-location, and the applicability of their device for use in indoor environments. And we also wanted to understand their experiences with impacted communities, if applicable. And since we only have a handful of interviews, the responses will be anonymized. So for the end users, these could be K through 12 instructors, students, nonprofit folks. We wanted to understand why they got into indoor air quality monitoring. We wanted to understand those challenges with deployment, procurement, troubleshooting, and we also wanted to understand whether or not significant changes in their behavior resulted as a after they adopted these monitors for their residential use. Next slide. Okay, so for our indoor air quality researchers, we did reach out to people that we knew. We wanted to understand their experiences with low-cost sensors, specifically for indoor air quality studies, and we wanted to understand how they had navigated research projects with impacted communities. So members of impacted communities spanned across the state. So once again, I pulled from my contact list, and I found these to be very informative. We wanted to understand their experiences, once again, their challenges, and I wanted to pull out information that was specific to those communities. Next slide. Okay, so just a little bit of metadata about what information was relayed during these interviews. So we'll start with the indoor air quality researchers. So the group of folks that we interviewed had a wide variety of experience across various pollutants, so particles, gases, and so forth. So what we found is that the standard practice among researchers for co-location and reference comparison is the same. You just co-locate for a few weeks and you make sure you do that intermittently throughout the study. So for the impacted community members, the common theme was that they are working with technical experts, so academics, manufacturers, to carry out these studies. And it can be very difficult to do this independently. Our sensor manufacturer, one tidbit that was interesting in terms of what's at the frontier of this work is integration of low-cost sensor technology for indoor air quality with our personal electronic devices. So that's going to include our phones, watches, and maybe even Fitbits. I guess you can consider that a watch. So for our low-cost sensor end user, we largely gained information about their experiences monitoring in their houses and in a school setting. Next slide. All right, so let's walk through the highlights. So things that we thought were important to bring forth from these groups. So bullet by bullet. So our researchers and manufacturer, they all recommended reference grade co-location. Okay, and this is very important for long-term applications because of sensor drift and sensor malfunctioning. So the community members and low-cost sensor end users, most of them reference the fact that the quantitative data doesn't mean much to them, but the colors, similar to the AQI color scale, are really helpful for interpreting information that comes from these low-cost sensing campaigns in impacted communities. Okay, so in terms of behavior changes, so the end users found that having sensors in their house was extremely beneficial for changing their behavior, mitigating exposures. But we found that in the impacted communities, cultural practices have a stronghold on behavior that's tied to emissions. So perhaps there needs to be more work done or more tailored mitigation strategies for impacted communities such that they can maintain those cultural and religious practices like burning candles for Catholic events. That was one of the examples. One thing that came up consistently amongst our impacted community members was this vulnerability around their housing. So whether they were afraid that the landlord wouldn't allow them to address these issues because they can just be evicted. Perhaps they can't make cosmetic or structural changes to their homes to improve indoor air quality. So as much as we want to outfit their homes with low-cost sensors, sometimes the action to mitigate those exposures is complicated by this renter tenant landlord relationship. So overall, everyone, a good majority of the stakeholders cited PM 2.5 and CO2 low-cost sensors to be fairly reliable. But there was this notion that total VOC and NO2 sensors may need some work. So in terms of public education for impacted community members and even end users, perhaps changing our media for how we disseminate this information could be useful. Yeah, and that gets into the last bullet. Excuse me, I'm combining those two. I'll talk about public education. So there definitely needs to be more public forums about monitoring data interpretation, sources, and strategies. I think digital and printed or information that's digital and available online may not be the most accessible form of communication for this information. And once again, getting into those different modes of communication. So TV, radio announcements that are multilingual, that service people that don't just speak English, maybe even digital video campaigns could be useful and posted on YouTube for those that have internet access that's reliable. Some even suggested the use of billboards being posted around the city for indoor air quality awareness. Even some of those electronic billboards that change every day. Next slide. All right, so some of the notable best practices. And so what we determined to be a best practice is information that we've collected from the stakeholders that also shows up in literature and on resources that us technical folks use all the time. So our manufacturer, I found this to be interesting, recommended that if you have an indoor monitor that may be showing up as 0, take it outside and see if you get an uptick in the reading to make sure that the sensor is still working. Of course, this is not recommended if you're downwind of a strong source like a barbecue. So once again, for a 0 reading indoors, this also could be related to the monitor or the sensor having a high detection limit, meaning it can't read very, very low concentrations. And this is true for total VOC low-cost sensors. So one of our impacted community members recommended that for folks that are starting out with low-cost sensor campaigns in communities, there should be a pretty thorough education campaign before any deployment starts, before any purchases even start. So starting with that education is really helpful for building trust and for ensuring that the folks receiving these sensors are well informed about what's going on. So this next bullet, an indoor air quality researcher stressed the need for us to use plain language explanations, so avoiding jargon for these applications. This next best practice is related to co-location. So if the deployment within a community is going to be near an ever-present source, like a refinery or a roadway or near a smelter, the best practice is to co-locate with a reference instrument in that environment as well, right? So this next list are public resources that were cited over and over by low-cost sensor users. Okay, so there is an EPA sensor guidance document that we cite extensively in our report. The AQ-SPEC website was popular amongst our stakeholders, and quite a few people referenced the manufacturer websites to look at their technical sheets. And any public fact sheets as well tended to be helpful in these applications. Next slide. So the caveats, I found these to be interesting, okay? So for the manufacturer, they warned that it's important to evaluate whether or not the monitoring packages are useful for residential versus industrial versus an enterprise scale monitoring exercise. Enterprise meaning multiple buildings or a building complex. So some of these sensors are developed for occupational applications and not necessarily residential. And that's reflected in the dashboard, that's reflected in the viewing window of these devices. Once again, they're quantitative and not really qualitative with color. One of our researchers recalled an anecdote where they installed a purple air near the vent of a gas-powered water heater. And so the effluent from that water heater caused an artificial spike in purple air readings. And so they warned us to make sure that residential deployments are not installed near a source at home. All right, so we've already talked about education. So for our longer term exercises, it is not clear that the current sensors on the market are useful for long-term applications. And in my view, this is longer than 2 years or so, but I mean, this is something that needs to be discussed perhaps at the ASIC conference. Right, so this next list of caveats, once again, is related to long-term use. So what do we do after 5 to 10 years? What is the recycling plan? What is the refurbishment plan? How does that factor into the costs or the overall lifetime cost of these sensors? What's best practices for maintenance, updating and repairs beyond the project period of a grant? Is the technical expert available during that time? I know there's organizations like the Bay Air Center who work directly with community members, and organizations like that could be a great source beyond a project period, perhaps. All right, and so last but not least, Wi-Fi. Something as benign as Wi-Fi and its availability can really complicate a community deployment. Not everyone has access to Wi-Fi, and not everybody is savvy with how to get a sensor online. So it could be challenging, once again, to get Purple Air online. I just went through this in a community where the internet was not reliable. Next slide, please. Okay, very good. So this really concludes our presentation. I think, Zoe, I would love to just leave the summary up to leave time for questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you to Sunny and Jennifer. This is a lot of great information and very useful for guiding us in the future how to utilize low-cost sensor, this accessible and cost-effectiveness tool. And also, we learn a lot from the interviews, what's the perspective and experience and challenges. So, If you have any question, you can raise your hand, use the raise hand icon on the bottom of the screen. And also, there are some questions in the Q&A session. Thank you, Anthony. You already answered some of the question, and there are two remaining questions. I can read it out. And first question is about low-cost sensor perform better indoors than outdoors. So from cooking to vacuum cleaning to incense burning, indoors has a more diverse particle size distribution than outdoors, which largely challenges the performance of low-cost sensors. And so I just want to get some explanation about how you draw a conclusion that low-cost sensor perform better indoor than outdoor.
Jennifer, do you want to answer that? I provided.
Yeah, so Dr. Ivy just talked about the high episodic events of emissions in indoor spaces. Also, for the evaluations that do perform better compared to the outdoors, they're using specific sources that, like for example, like smoking or incense, like you mentioned, they have a large part of their mass in that PM2.5 size range that is like easily detectable, so they can easily correlate with reference or research instruments. And obviously the researchers, whoever is doing their evaluations, know what source is being created for those pollutants, right? So I actually track it. In outdoor conditions, the impact of like temperature and humidity also affects not only the performance of the performance evaluation, but also like the homogeneity of that source, which can also like lead to like lower performance in outdoor conditions because it's like more variable compared to like more controlled and more specific in indoor spaces. But also the correlation of or the better correlation, right? The R squared does not also equate to like the actual true concentrations, because there's for some sensors that have good correlation, they'll have like poor accuracy. So like they really underestimate emissions or concentrations, or like overestimate concentrations. So like the correlation is very different from the actual accuracy of measuring the true concentrations of those sources. So keep that in mind.
Thank you, Jennifer. So there's another question about low-cost sensor at home. So we have carbon monoxide sensor in our home, normally attached to the roof. Are there a low-cost compact sensor for tracking our exposure to PM2.5 and L2 pollutant in homes? Yeah, I think this is the purpose of this study. We provide an overview of market available low-cost sensor, including those for PM2.5 and L2, and a lot of them can be used for indoor measurements. But as Dr. Ivy mentioned, we cannot endorse any specific model, but you can look at this study's finding and maybe choose the models that fit your purpose for indoor air pollution measurements. If you have any addition, Dr. Ivy, and yeah, okay. I think we have another question in the chat. Let me just find it out. Okay. Okay. One question is, did a community member ever report calibrating their sensors? I think this is mainly regarding like during the interview with community member, have they mentioned ever like they have practiced calibrating their sensor?
Not always. No. So I will elaborate. If the community members are using low-cost sensors for the purpose of publishing their results, likely they're working with a researcher who will then assist with co-location, but usually it's for education. And so co-location is not necessarily accessible or prioritized.
Thank you. Another question about the guidance document. Is the guidance document listing all the IAQ sensor and the recommendation available? Yeah. Well, the answer is yes. And all those documents will be available and posted on our project website when they are ready for the public. And we don't have a date yet, but if you want to obtain a copy, as for now, you can send an email to me. I can share a copy via email. And Okay. Barbara, I see there's a hands up. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. So it sounds like to me that sort of the bottom line for what you found was that there is more of a problem with the quality of the sensors versus the way they were being used. So, or is that not correct? So, if we're trying to improve low cost sensors and their use in the home. Um, in your opinion, which is more valuable? Is it really that people need to know more about how to use these sensors, or is it really that the sensors themselves need to improve for people to be able to get quality information from usage in the home?
I think there needs to be some generally more education that comes along with the purchase. Perhaps there's a video that comes along with your purchase, or but I will also say most of these sensors are based on the feedback of from what the end users would like to see in terms of qualitative data reporting. They are probably not suited for, I don't, in my opinion, they may be more research grade than anything else.
I think in the same light, while like you said, the accuracy is a problem, right? It's still evolving with manufacturers and like researchers contributing to that effort. But with the education, like Dr. Ivy mentioned, the way that these sensors are like deployed or like where they're placed in the home, if you're deploying it indoors, is also a big thing. So like if the user doesn't have enough education or doesn't really understand, that aspect of the device, that can also impact the performance or like the accuracy of like being able to either report measurements or like having stability like with the Wi-Fi or whatever connection that it needs for that reason. So that's also like a factor in the education space.
So it's like both, you
Yeah.
know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So there's a question to clarify. Were your performance results only looking at R square, relative performance, and not absolute accuracy per Dr. Ofdila's response to a prior question?
Yeah, so yes and no. So yes, because the R squared is like I don't want to say relative performance, like the response. Yeah, that can be a relative of performance, but the reason that we looked at the R score, like I mentioned, is because it's like the most consensus that we can have across studies, right? Because everyone, most stakeholders are publishing their results using that linear regression. But some studies did have information on the accuracy through like their error measures, right? So like AQSpec had the mean absolute error, and they also had like if it was overestimated or underestimating, and then others like verbatim said the percentage of like accuracy compared to like the reference or research instrument, or again other errors. So if you dig deeper, yes, accuracy is discussed for some studies, but yeah, the R squared is kind of relative, which is why I mentioned like the last question I answered, is that because a local sensor has a good R squared, that doesn't necessarily say that it's like a good sensor for a specific source because it can not be detecting any of the actual like pollutants, but it has like good correlation. Two can be true at the same time. That I've seen that a couple of times in the studies. So yeah, that's a good point to bring up.
Thank you. So this question about could you elaborate on ideas for multi institutional collaboration that could promote more low-cost sensor deployment? It's in Q&A window.
Dr. Ivy?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna reference this model for technical assistance centers that was brought about or became popular during the Biden-Harris administration. These centralized hubs where folks can just reach out to them and get advice. The Bay Air Center is an example of that. I think there just needs to be central hubs that are offshoots from some of these environmental, some of the environmental agencies where folks can just reach out if they need help. Jennifer, do you want to?
The accuracy question or the same comment you just made?
Yeah, like on Bay Air Center and how that's been effective.
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh. Yeah, I work at the district now, which helps lead or provides funding for the Bay Air Center. So the Bay Air Center is actually really beneficial to communities because they provide a lot of like guidance and useful information on how, to deploy these devices. Like for example, Dr. Ivy mentioned co-location, and sometimes we have contractors within the Bay Air Center that actually like go into the field with community members to actually help them with these local sensor like technical aspects. So um, kind of not really remembering the main points, multi-institutional collaboration. Oh, no, actually I do. So yeah, I think those collaborations are very important. The Bay Area Center has been very helpful. It's been running for the past couple of years. But also not only with like the air quality agencies, but like Dr. Ivy's lab herself, right? We work with when I was in her lab, I'm recently out of it, but we work with like a lot of communities. We, help with on the technical side for those deployments of local sensors, and just also providing more education as well, so that communities can ultimately become have that autonomy and they wouldn't need to rely as much on outside help. But yeah, it's needed at this point in time.
Thank you. Another question about accuracy of the measurements from these low-cost sensible gases such as NO2 and ozone is still an issue. For PM2.5, it's mostly robust. Is that correct?
At the current stage that we're at, for PM 2.5, when I'm with specific sources, I will say is there's still some issues, but it has higher confidence, I should say, right? Like PM 2.5 sensors have been really useful for wildfire detection at some sources in indoor spaces, but it's not optimal yet because PM 2.5 also includes some of those small particles that are not very easily detectable by these sensors. So yeah, for some sources, again, it's very source dependent. It's it's more so confident than for like NO2 and ozone and even VOCs. Yeah, that's definitely a fact there. The gases are still really lacking and improvements are needed there.
Okay, thank you. And let me see, do we have any more questions? I don't see any hands up, and let me see if I can chat. Okay. So, by the way, we have a lot of good discussion and information in the chat regarding like ongoing work on standard setup and also suggestion on variety of different low-cost sensors and their applications. So please take a look if you're interested in that. And thank you for all who provide those great comments in the chat.
And Zoe, before we round out, can you just show your contact information again so that they can take a screenshot one more time?
Sure thing, just a second. So this is my email address. So if you have any question, you can reach out to me, or if you want to obtain a copy of the slides or the document, the white papers itself before it's get posted online, please email me and I can send a copy to you. And also check back our project webpage for any updates.
Will the presentation be shared with attendees?
Yes, I can send out an email to all attendees with these slides attached.
Thank you.
Do we have any last minute questions? If not, I just want to thank you all for your time and for your comments and suggestions, and also want to say thank you to Sunny and Jennifer for a great presentation, and appreciate any follow-up question or comments. Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.